gonna have all the cameras off. Gives me like flashbacks to teaching online right when the panty hit, and it's like all black squares. That's crazy work. Okay. Any hooser. I'll just pretend I can see people. Oh, hey. Hey, y'all. Okay. It just feels more alive. I am Charisse Burden Stelly, or a Dr. CBS, as I am colloquially known. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you to Ujima and Geo for inviting me, and for the many people who put in the time and labor to make this happen. So I struggled a little bit with sort of how to structure these next two workshops, because I'm an academic and I can talk about literally anything. Like, I'm trained as a political economist and a political theorist, so there's a lot that I could talk about. But I thought that I would start this week with thinking a bit more historically, and then getting you all's feedback for the kind of theory and concepts that you want to discuss next week. So today I am going to talk about, because the sort of theme of the next couple of weeks is financial governance, I thought I would talk about 6 kind of historical forms of financial governance that cover a broad range of the ways that Black people, primarily in the United States, but also sort of diasporic Black folks, have thought about issues of self-determination, of how we politically and economically persist in some cases, or how we politically and economically struggle to overthrow what is and build something new. So I'll start with the 1820s and go through the 2000s, and then I'll end kind of each little section with a question that we might think about. I'll try to not talk for too long so we have plenty of time to discuss. We can go with the discussion questions. I'll also drop them in the chat, or anything else that comes up. And so the first organization I want to start with is called the Daughters of Africa. And this was an organization, a mutual aid organization, that was in existence from 1821 to 1829. So as you all know, or may not know, man, being a professor these days, I cannot assume anything. But I'm old too, so I don't even know what, I can't even have cultural references. Nobody knows what I'm talking about. But I assume that you know, this is the antebellum period, a period prior to the Civil War, prior to the end of enslavement here in the United States. And so these were free Black women. But as we know, even free Black people in the United States were in very close proximity to servitude and to enslavement. And so there are many mutual aid societies that are in existence. This one in particular was of interest because it involved about 200 Black women, African-American women, who did a combination of promoting social uplift through education and financial support, but also sort of did some monitoring of the community to make sure that those who were not only in the organization, but also who were part of the community, were following a particular code of ethics. And at this time, of course, to be a respectable, ethical Negro, one didn't drink, publicly brawl, publicly disagree, and the like. And, you know, while we call this the politics of respectability now, what we have to understand, in a time when Black people were not considered human and could at any time be thrust into a system of servitude, comportment is very important. And so we can extrapolate into the past our current values now, or at least we can try to understand what are the ways that people are trying to assert their humanity. And so the Daughters of Africa supported African Americans, not only who were in the organization, primarily those who paid dues to the organization, but also those in the surrounding community, with a particular focus on funeral expenses and burial. Because you know, they say the only things that are consistent are death and taxes. And to have a dignified burial and a dignified funeral means a lot to African people. And so that was one of the primary ways that they provided aid. And they were particularly helpful to recent widows, because the death of a husband could mean financial ruin. And so many Black women in particular were already very, very close to financial destitution. And so I thought that this was a very interesting organization for that reason, because while it because it is uplift of the Black community through helping a particular population that is especially susceptible to oppression and to kind of economic domination. And so the dues that were paid were a form of both affiliation, but also social insurance. And this created a sort of familial tone to the organization, as did many mutual aid societies. And it provided a social and financial support network for hundreds of Black women who are living in a time, again, when even if one was free, the proximity to enslavement and the possibility of enslavement was always imminent. So a discussion question that we might think about in relationship to the Daughters of Africa is, how can we think with the history to inform our own practices of mutual aid today? Of course, our mutual aid might look different, but it also might look similar. So the next organization, or the next thing I want to talk about, is the Universal Negro Improvement Association, but in particular, a few of the aims and objectives from a document called the Aims and Objectives of the UNIA, particularly number 4, 6, 10, and 11, because these most directly spoke to the economic project and the project of development. So the Universal Negro Improvement Association is an organization that was founded by Marcus Garvey in 1914 in Jamaica, was established here in the United States in 1916. And some noteworthy women who were part of the UNIA and helped to kind of develop and establish it were the two Amy's, his two wives, Amy Ashwood and Amy Jakes Garvey, and many, many others. But they're most known for kind of the Back to Africa movement, specifically trying to establish a sort of diasporic, we'll call it colony, but establishment in Liberia. But that was not their only focus. And so number 4 of the aims and objectives of the UNIA was to administer and assist the needy. And so they wrote, let it be your highest purpose in life to assist the needy members of your race. Use all your influence in your country, state, and town to help the needy elements of your race. Seek government help for them, seek philanthropic help for them, seek help anywhere you find it so that they may improve their conditions. And so here we see this understanding of responsibility to those in need within the community, that this is not only, it's not charity, this is an obligation. It is a responsibility of Black people to help those who are in need and to seek that help wherever one can get it, right? So we might say colloquially, like, get your ass off your shoulders, like, ain't too proud to beg. Like, we need to use every tool in our toolkit and every resource in order to help those who need it. For number 10, for number 6, they go on to say that there's an objective to assist in the development of independent Negro nations and communities. And here they're talking about how Black people, wherever they are, should live together. That if you live scattered about, that this undermines the power and potential of Black people. And so they say that in this respect, segregation is good. To do otherwise is bad. So, they say if there are 10,000 Negroes in a town, they should live close to each other. If there are 500, 1,000, or 1,000,000 in a town, they will have the power of their numbers to do business, to appeal to the governor, and to voice their rights as citizens. And so living together is important because this is how you assert collective power. We know that, Kwame Ture says that we revolt in mass. There's the saying that there's power in numbers, and this is what is being advocated, right? That wealth, the foundation of wealth, is unity and togetherness. Number 10 was to conduct a worldwide commercial and industrial intercourse for all people within the African diaspora. As I say, the economic life of the Negro is important. He lives by eating, wearing clothes, and living in a home. These are essential. To get these things, he must work either with his hands or his brains. The economic system lays down the fact that commerce and industry are the feeding factors in the economic life. Hence, it is absolutely necessary that the Negro builds an economic structure sufficiently strong enough to feed the arteries of his existence. Therefore, the Negro should indulge in every kind of business that is necessary to earn profit, because it is by profit that he will be able to obtain life's necessities for himself and his race. And so here we see Garvey is espousing a sort of capitalistic form of enterprise alongside this kind of community orientation. And again, this is something that is very endogenous to or embedded in our community. Very, very few of us, even though we kind of act and move socialistically or in terms of a communitarian ethic, we are largely a capitalistic people or strive to be so. And so, this is something that he's advocating, right? And so finally, the number 11 is the last one that I'll highlight from the aims and objectives of the UNIA. And he says to work for better conditions in all Negro communities. There should be a ceaseless effort among Negroes everywhere to improve their condition in every department of life and make their communities so prosperous as to compel the respect of their neighbor. No stone should be left unturned to advance from one stage of development and progress to another. There is always work to do in this respect. So again, accumulating wealth and being self-sufficient is not only to the benefit of the race, but also to garner the respect and the admiration of one's neighbors and by extension of other races. This is very Booker T. Washington. And of course, when he first came to the United States, he came because he wanted to meet Booker T. Washington. He very much respected Washington, but by the time he got here, Washington had passed away. And so Marcus Garvey is a very kind of multifaceted figure. He inspired so many people from Malcolm X to Kwame Nkrumah. The reason why Ghana has a Black star on its flag is because of the Black Star line of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. But at the same time, there are a lot of things to be sort of critical of Garvey. But what he did understand was that economic strength was foundational to any strong people. Okay, so then we have W.B. Du Bois. Now, if you ask 100 people about W.B. Du Bois, there will be 100 answers as to who he was. He lived nearly 100 years. He went through all sorts of different ideological transformations, if you want to call it that. But I like to put it that, it's not that Du Bois was hypocritical. It's that he was willing to use every single tool in the toolkit to figure out, like, how do we get free? Some, he's a human being, so he's problematic in some ways, but he was a towering figure. But what makes Du Bois Du Bois is that he was among people. He was always in organizations. He was always surrounded himself with the best and brightest people, however he defined that. He always surrounded himself with people with whom he could share a collective vision of how to help working people, Black people, colonized people. And in the 1930s, Du Bois took what we might call a sort of a Black nationalist or pragmatic nationalist turn, which, we often know Du Bois as a liberal. We almost never know that he joined the Communist Party in 1961, but we kind of know Du Bois as a liberal, right? But in this moment, in the 1930s, in the throes of the Great Depression, he took a nationalist turn. And this was especially pronounced at this conference called the Second Amenia Conference that happened at Howard University in August 1933. But then he had a series of writings around this time, one called The Right to Work, one called A Negro Nation Within a Nation, and one called Social Planning for the Negro Past and Present, where he urged Black people to plan a separate economy in the spirit of survival, self-preservation, and sustainable struggle. And so he called this pragmatic segregation. And it was sort of at the intersection of a socialistic approach and a nationalist approach. At this time, Du Bois was very critical of white workers, whereas the 1930s saw an uptick in Black people joining, like, the Communist Party, joining the Congress of Industrial Organizations when it was organized, and being attracted to communism and socialism. Du Bois, though, was critical of white workers because he thought that they ultimately were working in their own interest and had a sort of intractable or kind of very strong attachment to white supremacy. And because of this, he championed all Black cooperatives to secure Black economic betterment. And so he thought there should be Black consumer and producer cooperation. There needed to be planning of this separate economy, as well as intense scientific study. He thought that Black farmers had the capability of producing enough food for large segments of the Black population, that the artists and artisans could organize their services to produce clothing, shelter, and goods for Black people, and that Black workers could harness cheap power in the Southeast to form manufacturing cooperatives. And he thought that this economic protective separatism discouraged the exploitation, selfishness, and profiteering of a sort of American capitalism. And so again, what he's arguing for is Black collective enterprise. So a different than kind of what Garvey is advocating. He thought that it was through this Black nationalist effort that Black people could be properly educated, economically sound and unified, as well as self-supporting. At this time, he did not believe that, you know, as it, you know, the saying goes, Black, white, unite and fight was possible. But he did believe that Black people had the skills, resources, and collectively had the wealth to be able to build up a separate economy. We call this dual power now. But way back in the 1930s, the Bois is talking about this. So the question we might think about is, oh shoot, I think I forgot the question for the last one. Okay, so for this section, we might think about what could this protective separatism look like today, this dual power. Now for the Garvey section, the question is, how do we use financial governance to understand what we want for our communities? Or how does what we want for our communities shape how we understand financial governance? So let me drop these three questions so far. The first question was, how can we think with the history of the Daughters of Africa to inform our own practices of mutual aid? The second question is, how do we use financial governance to understand what we want for our communities? And then the third question so far is, what could a protective separatism look like today, or what we might call dual power? Okay. Now, next we'll talk about Harry Haywood and what's called the Black Belt thesis or Black self-determination. And this was something he advocated from 1928 all the way through the 1980s. So he was 10 toes down on this. No matter, he was a member of the Communist Party until from like in the 1920s until 1957. And even when the Communist Party switched its position on Black self-determination and the Black Belt thesis, he stayed 10 toes down all through that time, right? So he was very adamant that this is the way to understand Black people. And basically, long story short, the Black Belt thesis is this idea that there are 5 contiguous or kind of touching states in the US South that constitute the Black nation. This is where the majority or plurality of the Black population is located. This is the historical site of the plantation economy. It's called the Black Belt because of the rich soil. But basically, Joseph Stalin has a conception of he writes about what constitutes a nation. Like it includes common language, economy, some other stuff. And he said that the Black people fit these specifications. And so the idea was that because Black people constitute a nation within the context of the United States, they had the right to self-determination like any other colonized nation, and up to and including the right to secede from the United States if they so chose. We see this idea reproduced by the Republic of New Africa in like the 1960s and 1970s. But so for based on this understanding, Haywood understood the revolutionary solution was wide-scale expropriation and struggle against exploitation to transform the South or the Black Belt from a sort of agrarian hinterland or from a largely kind of sharecropping or plantation economy that was used by monopoly capital for its raw materials, cheap labor, and captive markets, and to transform that into a developed, progressive, democratic region. And that is the only way that not only Black people, but the United States writ large could be developed. And so expropriation means that you do not get to keep your shit. Like you take that land back from white slave owners, right? Now, to be fair, this isn't land back in the indigenous sense, right? And so we can argue that the Black Belt thesis has a blind spot, or what we call scotoma, a blind spot with regard to this being indigenous land. But what they did know is that the white people can't keep the land. And so central to this idea of self-determination, or central to this practice, was the idea of self-determination for the Black Belt. Now, there's a man named Gunnar Myrdal who wrote a very, very, very influential book called American Dilemma. And this was published in 1944. And Haywood was extremely critical of Gunnar Myrdal, who was a socialist. And then Myrdal's book was really, really influential on race relations. Oddly enough, a Swedish economist's book was kind of like the most influential book on race relations, but I digress. And so Haywood was critical of him because Myrdal did not advocate expropriation of plantation landowners. He thought that former slave owners should be fully compensated by the federal government, and that any expropriation of plantation land must be fully compensated, and that there needed to be a tax scheme in the South to compensate former captive owners and land hoarders. So he thought that, again, if this land was going to be redistributed, white people should be paid for it. And Haywood is like, absolutely not, right? That there is no wealth redistribution if that happens, and that you're legitimating the practice of enslavement and of dispossession if you pay back white slave owners or former slave or their descendants. And so Myrdal's position demonstrated not only an alignment with the ruling class, but also hostility toward the creation of a class of independent Black producers that would provide a challenge to monopoly capital. And so Haywood, again, he kept these ideas through the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, and he updated it to argue that the Negro liberation movement was a counterpart of the broader anti-colonial struggle that was taking place throughout the world at that time, and that it was central to overthrowing U.S.-led global imperialism. And this is where he started to understand the Black Belt as a sort of a semi-colony as opposed to a straight up colony. There's another man named Robert Allen who writes about this he talks about internal neocolonialism in a similar fashion. But anyway, still he's using this kind of colonial model. And so Haywood thought that throughout the 1960s, Black people still suffered from many of the things we suffer from today, such as high employment, concentration in semi-skilled and unskilled sectors, the concentration of the tiny percentage of Black farmers at the bottom tier of agriculture, and then the overall disadvantage nature of Black workers. And so these conditions, again, could only be overcome with land redistribution, primarily in the South, in the Black Belt. And it was that land redistribution that would create the conditions for not only Black liberation, but the overthrow of the fascist relations in the United States in general. Because it is through land is the basis of power, right? And self-determination is the basis of autonomous governance. And it is through that reality that white supremacist power relations could be broken. There's much more to say about Harry Haywood, but that is basically the crux. So for him, land redistribution without compensation, autonomy, and governance for Black people in the Black Belt. So we might think about the question, what did Haywood overlook when he was theorizing the Black Belt thesis? And then why we think this Black Belt thesis resonated with other organizations like the Republic of New Africa. They're not the only organization, but they're one of the main ones. So two more. I'm pretty good on time because we're supposed to turn the questions at 7:50 or 7 o'clock, but I'm still got 8 minutes. Okay, so the next one is James Forman. And there was a conference called the National Black Economic Development Conference that took place right here in Detroit. And they produced something called the Black Manifesto in 1969. And out of the Black Manifesto, they demanded $500 million in 1969 terms from the Christian white church and the Jewish synagogues. So they specifically made this demand on white religion because of their central and essential role in slavery, domination, imperialism. The Jewish synagogue part would be quite controversial today. It was pretty controversial then, caused a split in SNCC and all kinds of stuff. But because like these religions are some of the most are some of the wealthiest institutions in the world. The Mormon Church, interestingly enough, is the richest. They're worth $200 billion. Anyway, so that is who they said owed Black people money. And then they had a series of demands. I will quickly read. There were 10 of them. They wanted the establishment of a Southern land bank. They wanted the establishment of 4 major publishing and printing industries for Black people to break the hold of white stereotypes and misrepresentation. They wanted the establishment of 4 of the most advanced scientific and futuristic audiovisual networks, so control of the cultural apparatus. They wanted a research skills center. They wanted the establishment of a training center for the teaching of all sorts of different skills. They said, we recognize the role of the National Welfare Rights Organization, and we intend to work with them. We call for $10 million to assist in the organization of welfare recipients. They call for $20 million to establish a national Black labor strike and defense fund. They call for the establishment of an international what they call the International Black Appeal. And this would be funded with no less than $20 million. And it was charged with producing more capital for the establishment of cooperative businesses in the United States and in Africa. They call for the establishment of a Black university to be funded with $130 million to be located in the South. Now, this is different than a historically Black college and university. What we need to know is very quickly, this is happening in the context of the Black studies movement. And the Black studies movement was happening even at historically Black colleges and universities, because even though they had predominantly Black students, they still often had white boards, white money, many white professors, and they still were Eurocentric. And so even at HBCUs, they were demanding something called a Black university. And so this is what they're calling for here. And finally, they demanded that IFCO, which is, I think, is the International Federation of Church Organizations or something like that, that IFCO allocate all unused funds in the planning budget to implement the demands of the conference. So this is one of the, it's not the earliest, but it's one of the earlier kind of reparations demands, and they're very clear about where the money should come from. So our question might be, what is the role of reparations in our understanding of financial governance? Now, the last organization I'll talk about is called Red Thread. And this is a Guyanese organization. I'm going to drop the link in the chat. That was founded in the 1980s in a different iteration, but was established as Red Thread in the early 2000s. And the goal of Red Thread is to organize with women, beginning with grassroots women, to cross divides and transform their conditions. They provide services to women and children exploited in unequal power relations and simultaneously work to change those relations. So they're focused on women, and especially women who work in the informal economy or who lack sort of financial resources. And so their objectives that they state are to work for women's unwaged and low-wage caring work to be revalued and properly remunerated, and for equal pay of equal value. And so we call, some people call this social reproduction. So basically, you get paid for the work that you do in the household, or the care work, like taking care of old people, taking care of children, that is often unpaid or underpaid. Their objectives are to work against all forms of violence, especially against women and children, beginning with domestic violence and violence during racial and/or political conflict, and to support victims of such violence. They work to build solidarity among women across divides and to oppose all forms of discrimination, including discrimination on the grounds of sex, race, class, disability, age, sexual identity, and HIV status. Another objective was, wherever possible, to provide individual women and groups of women with information, skills, and other support they need to fight against economic, social, and political injustices. And finally, to develop, evaluate, and share the lessons of small projects addressing key issues, including grassroots women's income generation, women's health, and children's literacy. So here they're taking a grassroots approach and primarily focusing on women and children as the basis for uplifting the community in general. They are very collective, focused on small projects in the way that small projects can generate wealth and resources, and combining kind of crafts, advocacy, fundraising, and community care. So for this question, we need to consider, I think, how are we accounting for the informal, illicit, or unwaged economies and the lumpen proletariat in our efforts to control wealth and money? So quickly, the lumpen proletariat in a Marxist sense is those who are not workers. So for him, it was kind of like, excuse the language, it was kind of, people who might sell a little bit of weed and a little bit of other things, the seller and wares in one, as they are called. You know, people who try to make it all out of 15 cents, basically. That's kind of the lumpen proletariat. Marx had a very negative view. He thought they were a parasitic class, not unlike the capitalists. Whereas organizations like the Black Panther Party thought that the proletariat, the lumpen proletariat, was the most objectively revolutionary because they had the least stake in and the least benefit from the system. They had different types of skills that are foundational to the establishment of a different type of society. And there's in the Black Scholar, which is a very prominent and famous journal, there's a debate about the lumpen proletariat between several different people. So in 1969, you can look that up if you're interested. So I will stop there. Basically, what I just wanted to provide is a sketch of all of kind of different ways that Black people collectively have thought about, conceptualized, and organized for different ways to engender wealth governance. And these are all things that we can think alongside, whether or not we agree with the ideological underpinning. We can sort of think with them and make them our own based on what it is that we're trying to achieve. So I will stop there, and we can, just open it up, address some of these questions, any questions that you have, etc. There wasn't any assigned reading. I was just talking. So I see. Let me scroll up. Let's see if there's questions. I see one. Blah, blah, blah. Is that when Haywood wrote Negro? So Haywood wrote Negro Liberation in 1948. We just reissued that, by the way. He talked about the U.S., or excuse me, the black, the Black Belt as a semi-colony starting in the 1960s, like 1966. He wrote this piece in Soul Book. Soul Book was like a Black Power journal. This is when he shifted or updated his analysis from sort of kind of a dependent nation to a semi-colony. Looking back on the last 120 years you just covered, what are the key forces of power to which progress can be attributed? And feel free to start by defining progress if you feel that's necessary or helpful. I'm a dialectical materialist, so I think that progress is not linear. I think that it is relative to the correlation of forces, if you will. So, for example, it is progressive. So, if you think about like the Daughters of Africa, it is progressive or a moda, comparatively speaking, to think about how women, primarily 200 women, were able to come up with funds to take care of the basic needs in their community, especially around burial. For the UNIA, it is extremely progressive to assert that Black people are not backward savages who need white tutelage and to believe that Black people can govern themselves and can be self-determining and self-sufficient, right, against this all kinds of distortions that are levied at Black people and so on. So all of that to say, I think that there are ways to identify progressive forces in any given moment, but I don't think that we can make an argument that a move through time is a move toward betterment. There are changes, right? There are some things that improve and some things that are worse. So we are not enslaved anymore, technically, right? But we have all sorts of enslaving types of technologies, in my perspective, that are making us give away our freedoms and our abilities and our skills, and are making us less able to fight. So that is my errant ramblings on that. Land back. I'm just reading the chat. Feel free to chime in. I'm just kind of reading the things that were dropped in the chat. I have to read more about wondering about land back to Indigenous people across the U.S. since there is focus on Black Belt. Yeah. So most of the one of the extreme oversights, and Gerald Horne talks about this a lot, of like this form of thinking is that there is not any engagement with indigenous thought or the idea of land back. There's a sort of kind of production of the idea that indigenous people are all they're are, you know, what's done is done, right? That they're there, but that they're not treated as historical actors, right? Um, for us, I think that the Republic of New Africa is a much more sort of updated understanding of what that would look like. It would involve um discussion, collaboration, community building with indigenous folks, and a commitment to be stewards of this land, right? Because I don't think I'm not of the perspective that Black people are settlers, right? Some might call it involuntary denizens. And that I think that matters, but I think that where there is consensus is that the colonizer got to go. So, um, but I think that has to be kind of worked out in real time. So a semi-colony is a nation or an area that is not, so it's not third world, so to speak. It has some manufacturing, but it still has relations of dependence. So it is it doesn't export only primary commodities. It has some secondary commodities. It has some small manufacturing, but it is still largely a dependent nation and suffers from some aspects of underdevelopment. So domestic and internal colonies. So you can have a domestic or internal semi-colony. Semi-colony has to do with the level of development. Domestic or internal has to do with the fact that the colony is within the belly of the beast proper as opposed to out there. They're kind of interchangeable, domestic and internal. Oh, there's a hand. Bria.
Yeah, peace everyone. Thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was very informative, and presented very well. This is my first time at one of these like Ujima anything. Hello everybody. But I wanted to respond to the question of what did Haywood overlook and why did the black belt thesis resonate with folks, and you kind of just mentioned it, some of what I was going to say about what he overlooked, which is like, of course, the indigenous peoples, like, this being indigenous land. And I agree with you that the Republic of New Africa has taken that idea forward, but has developed in a more scientific way. And it is of like the policy of the Republic of New Africa to recognize indigenous land claims that precede theirs. And they are like an ally of indigenous nations and a number of like, I mean, colonized people here and globally. So I agree with you there. And well, as far as why it resonated, I think the black belt, I mean, just even today, I just think about like the visceral connection that black folks in this country have to land, have to the South because of it, like you said, it being the historical kind of place like of the plantation economy is where we labored for generations, where we died, where so many radical movements like came up out of the South, in like the worst of worst conditions in the black belt, considering like, Jim Crow and just racial apartheid that was just so prevalent there. So there's a very deep connection that folks have to that land and the idea of, that those people and that geography making a nation, I think resonates with folks because of those reasons, just generations of history and the cultural and connections that we have there. And I think that is still true today. I'm from Virginia. My people are from the Carolinas, and the Bahamas on my dad's side, but like it's of our tradition to like send our people or send our for our parents to like send us down south, you know, to spend time in the south, and you know, to know, you know, like just to touch the soil, know the land, you know, and maintain those connections. So I think it's still something that is very like visceral to Black folks today. But yeah, that's what I had to say in response to those questions.
I think something that has not been, I don't know if it's been thought about or not, but that I have not heard and that I constantly bring up is by the question of Haiti as an example, or Cuba. We know that when Haiti became the only nation in the world of formerly enslaved people to win their independence, they have been relentlessly hounded from 1804 to today, up to and including having to pay indemnity, which is reparations to France, right? Which they were paying up until like a 2024. Cuba, right? Cuba had the audacity to have a revolution, which is also an African revolution. If you look at the revolutionaries, there are African people, and Cuba has one of the largest population of Africans in outside of Africa. That being said, right, from the outset, embargo, right, blockade, starve, you know, making the revolution completely difficult. Now, what do you think the United States will do to a nation within the borders that it has commandeered? And I think that that needs to be taken extraordinarily seriously. And I don't know that, and Haywood has not considered this, right? And so there's a way, I always, something I say often is that we need to believe our own analysis. And so if we believe that the US is a vicious and savage, monstrous imperialist, we see what they're doing to Iran, for example. Do you think that a, a colon, a nation bordering it of formerly enslaved people, right? Of people that they still obviously, that oftentimes they don't see as their equals, think they're going to let Black people? What do you think that that's going to mean structurally for that nation? And so that is something that needs to be taken very seriously. And what does that look like militarily? What does it look like to defend, right, the nation, the Black belt nation? So, what else?
Dr. CBS, we have a question in person.
Please.
Thank you. That was so helpful and really just raised so many questions for me. And um, I guess the biggest one, and I don't know where this. I'm not an academic, so it's really from a very just living everyday perspective question. If, if you're a dialectic materialist, is that what you said, or did somebody in the chat say that?
That's what I said.
Okay. So, what does that mean with so much power in the hands of people that literally don't don't care about the earth?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean when you have people that don't value it?
I think that dialectical materialism means that there are also simultaneously people who care deeply about it and who value the land deeply, and that the outcome of what is to come has to do with the antagonisms between those groups and what it means, you know, that's real life. So yes, there are people who they would rather they would destroy the planet so that a very very tiny percentage of them can have a yacht, I guess, profit. But there are very many people who um like are, they are the land, right? Like their cult, like everything about them is the land. And so like this is why a lot of people are doing so badly because of, they are the land and the land is being assaulted systematically. So I think that the problem is that those who do not care about the land have the most power, and so their voices are loudest. But I think that in just real terms and real numbers, there are many, many more people who do care about the land and who are stewards of the land and who will literally risk their lives to protect the land. It's just a matter of how do we organize and amplify that power. So that, and that's real. And there's many ways that can be and is practiced like every day, and it's beyond just like not littering. I think every time you struggle against like a data center, it is out of that profound commitment to the land, for clean water in Flint, against the Dakota Access Pipeline, against forms of, Cancer Alley in Louisiana, against the environmental racism. That's a reflection of people who, even as they've been dispossessed by those who don't care about the land, they're still, they do care, right? And so, as they say, if we must die, to quote Claude McKay, right, they're gonna fight for it and continue to come up with ways to not only save ecologies, but also to rehabilitate them as well.
Right. I guess the rest of the question then is, that's not just materialist, right? It's deeply, it's something else. It's spiritual. It's people's relationship and being like you said, being a part. So it's how do you bring in that aspect of who people are? It's like I totally agree with you. We are the earth. We come from the earth, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that I guess that's what I'm always grappling with. It's like, what are the sort of spiritual dimensions of this struggle, and how we lift them up as much as we're lifting up the materialist aspects.
To be a dialectical materialist is to understand, is a particular way of understanding how history unfolds. But it's not economic determinism, right? It's not to discount spirit and soul and culture. That's a misunderstanding of dialectical materialism. It's simply to say that that the material world, and that the antagonisms and forces that arise out of the material world are the drivers of history. That's what it means to be a dialectical materialist in its essence. And so I don't think that what I am saying, what you're saying, are at odds or are antithetical.
It's just a question that I'm struggling with. It's like, it seems so big as we encounter this craziness of people with a lot of power. So thank you. Just hearing everything laid out like that was so helpful, because there's so many ways that we have survived and thrived. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, you could think whatever you want about Iran and their internal contradictions, but what we do know is that materially they are beating the empire like a redheaded stepchild of a rented mule. And it is their spirit, it is their belief in their religion that is driving that reality, alongside their material or their military capabilities. And you cannot separate one from the other. So I agree with I'm in agreement with you that it's not just the material, that what makes Iran, like so much of what is driving them, so much of the resilience of the Palestinian people is their deep faith, is their spirituality and connection to the land, period. And the United States ultimately can destroy the world, but it will never win in that realm, because they steal other people's land and spirit and culture, right? So